So to get back to the original point, that raises a very interesting question. A question that has been studied and studied and studied and studied, and several different theories have been offered. Why does the Supreme Court decide to hear some cases and not others? Anybody who files an appeal wants the Supreme Court to hear their case. But why does the Supreme Court decide to hear Thomas's appeal, but they decide not to hear Alyssa's appeal? Right? Alyssa wants her appeal, the court to hear her appeal just as much as Thomas wants the court to hear his appeal, right? Well, as I said, lots of different theories have been offered to explain that. I'm going to introduce you to just two, again, in the interest of time, okay? The first, merits consciousness, says that, in an effort to explain why the Supreme Court hears some cases and not others, this theory says that there is a link between, you have to think about this theory on the level of an individual justice, okay? Chief Justice or Associate Justice, Chief Justice John Roberts, or Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, or Associate Justice Clarence Thomas, or Sonia Sotomayor, who, individual justices, right? They're ultimately, potentially going to take two votes, cast two votes on any given case, okay? The first is on the question of whether to hear the case from the start, okay? The second is on the merits of the case itself if the court does hear the case, okay? So what this theory is arguing is that there's a link between those two votes, such that if the justice issues a vote in favor of issuing the writ of certiorari, that is linked to a likely vote later on, if the court hears the case, to reverse the lower court's decision. And conversely, a vote against issuing the writ of certiorari is linked to a vote to affirm the lower court's decision. In other words, what this theory seems to be suggesting is that the reason that a Supreme Court justice would vote to review a case in the first place is because they think the lower court got it wrong, and it needs to be corrected as a matter of law. Does that make sense? On the other hand, if they think the lower court got it right, they're less inclined. I mean, after all, they can only review 80 or 100 cases, right? So if the lower court got it right, then maybe they just leave it alone. That seems to be what the underlying argument of this theory is. It also seems to suggest, or at least imply, that the justices have already given thought and consideration to cases and how they should be decided before the case ever comes before the court, before oral arguments or written arguments are ever made before the United States Supreme Court. And that's really not, it's certainly not a stretch to think that a Supreme Court justice has thought about these cases. I mean, they're not, these are brilliant people for the most part. They're very, accomplished people in the field of law. They're certainly not, and they're also, active in the political life of the country more generally, and they're certainly aware of things that are going on around them. It's not like they just sit in chambers and do nothing else except for wait until cases come before them. They know what's going on out there in the world. It's very likely that they have given some previous thought or some previous consideration to these types of questions, right? But the question of whether or not they predetermined before oral arguments or written briefs are ever submitted to the court is hard to substantiate. And in fact, I'm going to tell you as an empirical political scientist that while I find this theory very interesting, I find it very compelling, and I'm certainly not being dismissive of it, what I will tell you is that there's not a lot of empirical evidence to support it. Okay? You understand what I mean when I say empirical evidence? Like, there's not a lot of real-world data I said that there's not a lot of empirical evidence. We know, for example, that there are many, many cases where the Supreme Court issues the writ of certiorari, reviews a case, and sustains the lower court decision. Right? This would, you're absolutely on the right track, because what this theory would seem to suggest is that most of the time, if the court reviews a case, it's going to overturn the lower court decision. Now, I don't think that can be substantiated by the data. I don't have any numbers to report to you on that, but there's certainly enough evidence of the court affirming lower court decisions that we have to say, there's not a whole lot